Hi everyone, we're going to begin our first formal analysis with Amanda Gorman's poem, The Hill We Climb. Some of you may have seen her read this at the presidential inauguration this year, and I also have included a link so that you can watch it. But if you have seen her read it, you'll know that the poem is in what we call open or free verse. And so one of the things that we'll be doing this semester is collecting a list of literary terms. I've included a link to that in this assignment. And so I want to first look at the link for form. So I've included a helpful text about this. But form, when we're talking about poetry, just has to do with the structure of the lines on the page. So are the lines broken up into regular groups of lines or stanzas, right? So like a couplet has 2 lines, a tercet has just 3, and do those lines have repeated rhythm or meter, right? So do they sound the same, like da 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 da? So nursery rhymes have often have what's called a fixed form. You also have that with things like sonnets or haikus, or other forms where there's that kind of regular meter. In contrast, a free verse poem doesn't have any regular meter or rhythm, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have rhythm or meter. And so Amanda Gorman's poem uses free verse, and in that way, it actually situates itself in a much longer, very, very American tradition, beginning with poets like Walt Whitman, who started to write in free verse as a way of kind of rebelling against established forms, particularly those that came from England. Okay, so if you've heard her read it, you know that just because it's in free verse doesn't mean it doesn't have a rhythm and a lot of rhyme, right? So what we'll be doing now is kind of paying attention to that. So I'm going to read a little, and then I'm going to point out what it is that some of the formal elements. When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? So from the very first lines, we have the establishment of a symbol that's going to continue throughout the rest of the poem, and that's this contrasting tension between light and dark. All right, so what that does is it sets up a kind of a contrast, right? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. We've braved the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace. Here we have an example of rhyme, right? So even though we don't necessarily have a strict rhyme scheme like A, B, right? There is still rhyme. And what you'll notice is that the rhyme establishes a kind of rhythm here. And so you'll have, in this case, a line that's a little bit shorter. We brave the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace. So the rhyme connects those 2 lines together in an interesting way, connects 2 very contrasting words, beast and peace. But it also helps to give some kind of established rhythm, even though it's not exactly the same. Right, so this is what we would call rhyme. And the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. So there's a bunch of things happening right here. First, we have something called alliteration. And so that is when you have the repetition of similar sounds at the beginning of words. So na. We also have an example of enjambment. And so enjambment is when a line of a sentence, essentially, in a poem gets continued onto the next line. It doesn't have the opposite of that, which is end stopping. So end stopping just means that the end of a line is the same as the end of a poetic sentence. And so what that does is it kind of builds up speed, right? And the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. And so you'll notice when she's reading it, she starts to speed up in some of these sections. And there is a variety of line lengths here, which does have an influence on how she speaks. She also does something here which a lot of people love, including somebody named Shakespeare, and that's a pun. So here she's playing on the sounds of these words, just is and justice. And that's kind of connecting those two ideas, defining justice, or defining what is just and what we think of as justice, and making kind of showing that there's a space between those things. All right, and yet the dawn is ours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we've weathered and witnessed, more alliteration, a nation that isn't broken but simply unfinished. Here we have something, and it's kind of similar to the just is and justice. And it's rhyme, but it's near rhyme or half rhyme. It's not exactly the same. And she does that quite a lot in this poem. We, the successors of a country in a time where a skinny black girl descended from slaves and raised by a single mother can dream of becoming president only to find herself reciting for one. Here she establishes who the speaker of the poem is. And though she connects it with who she is as a person, right, this does track onto her own biography. Whenever we're thinking about a poem, the speaker is a persona. It's not necessarily the same person biographically as the writer. But she does, and this is something she does throughout the poem, is allude to, and allusion is an indirect reference, but here she's alluding to the history of America as a country which has very lofty ambitions or ideas of itself that it doesn't always achieve, or hasn't always achieved, right? And this is particularly true for historically racialized or minoritized people, and our history of slavery, and then the subsequent segregation and other racial injustices are part of our history that we have to grapple with. But this idea of America and the American Union as something that we aspire to rather than something that exists is also found in the symbol in her title, right? The hill we climb. This is something that we're doing. It's not like that, we're already there. We're already this city on a hill from which we look at other places. And actually, this is how America was actually described by some of the early our forefathers. I don't know if we're still going to use that term, as this city on a hill, a kind of beacon to other places of justice and other things. And here she's using it kind of. She's making a kind of ironic allusion to that as well, right? We're not yet a city on a hill. We're not yet a beacon for other places of justice and freedom and liberty, etc. Okay, so I'm going to read a little bit more quickly. And yes, we are far from polished, far from pristine, but that doesn't mean, here we have another rhyme. This is an internal rhyme, where instead of the rhyme happening at the end of the sentence, it happens in the middle. And this is also something she does quite a bit. It happens a lot in hip hop as well, where you have so much rhyming happening that it's not just occurring at the end of lines. We are striving to form a union that is perfect. We're striving to forge a union with purpose. And here, perfect and purpose, they don't rhyme. It's a near rhyme. And that near rhyme points out the difference between those two things. We don't need a perfect union, but we need some sort of purpose. To compose a country committed to all cultures, colors, characters, and conditions of man. Notice the alliteration, but also notice this idea of what we're doing not as living in this country, but actually composing it with our own actions and with our own writing, right? Composing is a word with multiple meanings, and you can compose a song, you can compose a country, but you can also compose a poem. And so we lift our gazes not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. We close the divide because we know to put our future first, we must first put our differences aside. Just notice the way that these rhymes are coming fast, right? And when you're hearing her say it, it sounds like music. We lay down our arms so we can reach out our arms. Here she's using the same word, but with different meanings. So you have a kind of metaphor. You also have what's called absolute or perfect rhyme, when it's the same exact word. Of course it rhymes, it's the same word. To one another, but again, this shows a huge difference. It's one thing to pick up arms, right, which is a weapon, and another thing to think about putting our arms around each other, right? That contrast is huge. We seek harm to none and harmony for all. Let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true, that even as we grieved, we grew, that even as we hurt, we hoped, that even as we tired, we tried. And there we have a little bit of, it's also alliteration, but it's also consonants, right? That's where the repetition is, there it is, subsequent consonant sounds. And then we also have something called anaphora. And that's that even as we. So anaphora is when you repeat the same phrase at the beginning of subsequent lines. And that happens in speeches, it happens in sermons and things like that. That will forever be tied together, victorious, not because we never again know defeat, but because we will never again sow division. Scripture tells us to envision that everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. If we're to live up to our own time, then victory won't lie in the blade, but in all the bridges we've made. Here, the rhyme connects two very different ideas again. Blade, something that severs. Bridges we've made is something that we connect. Okay. The hill we climb. Here she's referring to the title and explaining what the hill is. The hill we climb, if only we dare. It's because American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. Kind of an amazing rhyme. We've seen a force that should shatter our nation rather than share it, would destroy our country if it meant delaying democracy. Here she's alluding to the January 6th insurrection. And I'm just going to jump down to the last section where she writes, if we merge mercy with might and might with right, then love becomes our legacy and change our children's birthright. So let us leave behind a country better than the one we were left with, every breath from my bronze-pounded chest. We will raise this wounded world into a wondrous one, alliteration. We will rise from the gold limb hills of the west. Here she's alluding to Maya Angelou, whose poem Still We Rise is another dramatic depiction of what America can be. And Maya Angelou was also the first Black woman to recite at an inauguration. We will rise from the lake-rimmed cities of the Midwestern states. Here she lists all of these different parts of the country, and in that way she's alluding to Walt Whitman, who's often considered the first truly American poet who was writing during the 19th century and whose career spanned slavery, the Civil War, and the end of Reconstruction. And one of the things that he did and felt that he could do as a poet, and that only a poet could do, was unite a country that was basically grounded in difference. And so she ends with, the new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. So she ends this poem that has all of these symbolic references to a contrast between dark and light, with a conception of light that has to do with not only light that we can see, but this sense that light is something that we can actually embody. Right? So, if we were to perhaps write a thesis statement based on this poem, where we go from our formal observations to some kind of analysis, one thing that we might do is say in her poem, and poems are always in quotation marks, the hill we climb. Amanda Gorman uses, let's say, symbols and rhyme to present the contrasting options available for America after, to say, 4 years of division and pain. Right? So for your first essay, you will be writing a formal analysis, which is going to have a thesis. And this is something you might want to use, that you could use as a kind of template or an example. So a thesis and a formal analysis gives the title of the poem, the author, and then which elements that you're going to use and what you think they mean, or how you think they impact the poem's meaning. All right. Thanks.